Welcome to Altea Talks, the brand new podcast series being brought to you by Altea, the unique provider of combined insurance and risk management solutions designed exclusively for the medical, allied health and care sectors. I'm going to be your host, Will Marshall, and I'll be joined in this series by some of the leading movers and shakers from across the sectors. My guests are going to include practitioners and professionals, regulators, clinical risk and governance specialists, and an array of legal experts who are going to help us get to the heart of the hottest topics affecting the UK's health and social care sectors today. So, if you're looking for frontline knowledge and expertise, if you want valued insights into these most dynamic, challenging and rewarding of sectors, then look no further because you're in the right place. Welcome again to Altea Talks. Hello, this week I'm very pleased to welcome my esteemed former colleague Joanne Staphnill as my guest on this latest episode of Altea Talks. Jo is an expert medical malpractice lawyer. She specialises in defending health and care professionals, clinics and hospitals against all sorts of negligence claims. In addition, Jo is a hugely experienced insurance law expert. She is frequently sought out by insurers for advice on policy coverage and policy drafting issues. Away from her legal claims work, Jo is a leading authority in providing medico-legal advice. Jo and her team pride themselves on providing calming reassurance to anxious health and care sector professionals in their hour of need. Jo's informed, common-sense approach means that her medico-legal advice is invariably straightforward, pragmatic, and always legally astute. Jo has a particular interest in risk management and has many years of expertise in providing risk management counselling and professional conduct training to her clients, as well as training on numerous other aspects of healthcare and insurance law. Jo, a very warm welcome to Altea Talks.
Oh, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
In this episode, we're going to be talking about a subject that I know is very close to both of our hearts, namely the beauty and aesthetic sectors. And in particular, we're going to be focusing on the importance in those sectors of online reviews and digital interactions, both how that affects the customer experience, but also how the professionals working in those sectors can safely and effectively manage their online reputation. This is a bit of a legal minefield, as you'll be aware. So we'll be looking at some of the practical steps that people can take to navigate the legal challenges associated with online complaints and criticism while minimizing the potential reputational and financial harm. So, Jo, we are where we are at the moment. Why have online reviews and social media and digital chat rooms become such an integral part of the overall customer experience for clients and for professionals in the beauty and aesthetic sectors?
Well, I think there are a variety of reasons, really. I think it's partly because it's part of how our culture has developed more generally, particularly online. You'll find yourself being asked to review all sorts of services and products in your life these days, everything from hotels to things you might buy online. So partly these have become important because this kind of trust economy, if you can call it that, is part of how we live now. I think it's particularly important in the beauty and aesthetic sectors because the types of treatments and procedures that you'll seek in that area are typically elective. You don't have to have them in order to live or be healthy necessarily, but you do want them to maximize how you feel and how you look and present yourself in the way you want to present yourself to others and for your own benefit as well. And so given that they are completely elective and given that the result is typically so important to the patient, they want to do their research and find somebody that they can trust to carry out those procedures, even if it is a procedure that perhaps they've had a number of times before. it's increasingly important for the professionals themselves as well, because, as I say, we do live in this culture now where we have this trust economy building up, and a glossy website is not necessarily going to be enough to give patients that confidence that they want in you. And so having good reviews online can be a way to help you stand out from the crowd or help you compete effectively and just really round out the information that you have about yourself online and show that it's not just that you have the glossy website and the beautiful clinic, it's also that real people who have come to you have been happy and satisfied. So it's important in all of those ways. And I think it very much is here to stay. I don't think we can predict this trend going away anytime soon.
No, I certainly agree with that. I mean, it always strikes me when we're thinking about this subject, about the apparent disconnect between the competing trends on the one hand of customers and clients sharing often very detailed and sensitive personal data on public platforms, and on the other hand, the huge legal importance that is attached quite properly to protecting patient confidentiality, to maintaining privacy, and to handling sensitive personal data in a way that is compliant with GDPR and so on. I mean, how do we reconcile that apparent disconnect?
Well, in some ways, I think they can't really be reconciled. I think this is one of the very counterintuitive aspects of this trust economy and the rise in beauty and aesthetic patients and clients wanting to post things online about their procedures. The stark reality of the matter is that your patients and your clients have a complete right to post whatever they like about themselves, but you, the professional, have an absolute duty to maintain their confidentiality. And I think the result of this is that it might seem very unfair to some practitioners that might be facing negative reviews online, perhaps. It might seem unfair, but the reality is that it's not a level playing field. The patient themselves, it's their information, it's their lives, it's their bodies. They can say whatever they like about that and their treatment online. It's their right. But you do not have the same right. I think the important thing to remember is that just because your patient has posted something about a procedure online doesn't mean that they've waived or given up their right of confidentiality. It's this far and not a jot further. You can't build on that. You can't respond to it. And you know, we'll probably discuss later in more detail, you can't correct them if you think that they've said something incorrect, because you can't do that without putting online a new piece of information that wasn't there before, that your patient hasn't given you the permission or the right to speak about. So I think they are irreconcilable in some ways. This new culture of people commenting online in a very public and often indelible way, that's their right, but it does not change or undermine any of the ethical rules that we've grown up with, which is you're the professional, this is your patient or this is your client, you must guard their confidentiality perfectly, and that's just the way it is.
Yes, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, given the sort of very one-sided nature of what we've just been discussing, given the fact that digital reviews, like them or not, are here to stay, what do we think? Do we think they're a good thing, or are they a bad thing for somebody who's running a beauty or aesthetic clinic?
Well, that's an interesting question, because I think it depends on a few different factors. I think it partly depends on what's actually been said about you, of course, because if you've been quite lucky and you've only had happy clients and happy patients who are kind enough to post positive things about you, then typically that's a good thing. It certainly can't hurt, can it? So it partly depends on what's said about you. But I think also it depends on whether your practice depends on your online profile to attract new patients and new clients. So I think part of the answer to this question depends on your own knowledge and your own analysis of where your clients come from, where your patients come from. So to perhaps compare two situations, you might have one practice where 90+% of your patients come from personal referrals or word of mouth or referrals from another practitioner perhaps, and in those situations, perhaps the online reviews are less important if they're important at all. But there are other practitioners who very much rely on, for example, their Instagram page to attract new patients. And for those people, they are reliant on people who don't know anything about them to read about them online and decide to come to them. And so for those people, yes, it can be a bit more important to know how many good reviews you have versus bad reviews. But there's no absolute answer. There's no answer that applies to absolutely everybody. So I think it is worthwhile for everybody to do some thinking, do some measuring about where your patients come from, and get a sense in your own individual practice of how much you depend on your online profile. If it's not very much, then perhaps you don't have to spend so much time and effort in looking after your online profile and what your reviews say about you. But if you are very dependent on it, then it's certainly something you need to take more care over and devote some time to.
So what are the ethical considerations and precautions that professionals need to keep in mind when they are seeking positive reviews or positive feedback in the chat rooms, and particularly when those professionals are regulated by the NMC or the GMC? What sort of obligations do those impose on them?
Well, I think that's a really important question, because there's a well-known PR tip, which is if you are unlucky enough to have a few negative reviews, that's not the end of the world, because you can seek some positive reviews. And over time, hopefully you'll end up with predominantly positive reviews that outweigh the bad reviews. And I've heard a PR tip to the effect of, as long as your reviews rating is 4.6 stars or above, then you're probably fine, because sensible people will ignore the odd disgruntled negative review. After all, you can buy positive reviews, which we do not recommend, because that would be unethical for anybody who is regulated by the NMC or the GMC. So don't buy positive reviews for an absolute start. But it is well known that unethical people can buy positive reviews. So a 5-star record can look a bit sus. So don't worry about the odd negative review. But yes, this PR advice generally is, well, go and get some positive reviews. Ask your clients and your patients to review you and put a positive comment down, and that will outweigh the bad comments. And that is good PR advice. But if you are regulated, there are some nuances around that, as always. So I think the absolute key thing is to remember patient confidentiality is absolutely imperative. It remains that way, even if you're seeking a bit of positive feedback. So tips might include, consider whether you're asking your patients to just post an anonymized, or not even post, to give you an anonymized testimonial that you can post on your website or post on your own social media feeds yourself. And that's good, because of course, not every patient engages in this trust economy behavior. Not everybody wants to review absolutely every service or product they've ever bought. So, many people just simply, however happy they are with your service, will not want to put anything online about it. You've got to respect that. So a way to get around that can be to ask if they're willing to write a completely anonymous testimonial. You can pop that on your website. Another way to do it is, if they are willing to post a review themselves in their own name, you've got to ask very gently. You mustn't imply that there's any pressure to do that. Just ask them gently if they would consider posting a review. That way you're not putting them under pressure. And I think the other thing to do is recognize that this is quite a long and time-consuming process. If you've got 100 patients, then it might even be that 95 of them do not want to put anything public about their procedure online. It can be a very personal thing, even in today's society where procedures and treatments and things like that are, there's no stigma, or there shouldn't be any stigma attached to any of that, but some people just want to keep it private, and that's their right. So it might be that 95% of your patients don't do that. They don't post things online. So you've got to be patient to wait for that 5% of patients to come along, be happy, and be willing to post a review for you. So it's something that takes a lot of time. Don't try and add pressure to your patients to get a quick fix. There's no such thing. Another important thing to avoid is don't offer any rewards or inducements for your positive review. Don't buy them from your individual patients, in effect. Even things like discounts off future treatments, that could be a little bit borderline, a little bit grey area, because of course this is an integrity issue, and we have to remember that trust and confidence in the profession is one of the things you have to uphold. And if you're seen to be or thought to be essentially rewarding people for artificially positive reviews, then that's problematic. And I think that's the way to make sure that you gradually and over time gently get your positive reviews. If you don't do that consistently over time, then it's a very, very difficult thing to quickly get a lot of positive reviews, because it's just not how everybody lives their lives. It's not how everybody wants to behave. And you can't guarantee that you'll have a cohort of oversharing, reviewing positive patients within a week or a month. It's got to be done over time.
Yes, thank you. And in terms of the legal risks that professionals ought to be bearing in mind and ought to have be taking account of when they're looking to raise their own profile or showcase their skills or ask their customers to provide positive reviews on their own social media pages or websites, can you give some examples of what those risks, those legal risks look like, and also the steps that professionals can take or should be taking to best protect themselves against those risks?
So we've talked so far about patient confidentiality, which is a very long-standing concept in healthcare. But more recently, we've had GDPR and the Data Protection Act come into force. And that has really brought into focus the legal risks. It hasn't particularly introduced new rules around this because there was a previous Data Protection Act in force, but it has really brought into focus the risks. And essentially, the risk is that if you are using your social media channels to post your own good news stories about treatments, perhaps a really good before and after set of photos, or a little comment about a patient, that you think you've done a really good job for, the danger is that if you post too much about that real life patient, you will actually breach the Data Protection Act. I'll give you an example of a doctor I knew of that had this problem. They had done a really lovely treatment on a patient's face. Patient was absolutely delighted, and the doctor was delighted as well. It was a really good outcome. And this doctor had seen on Instagram and some other places that increasingly his competitors were posting before and after photos of their patients. So this doctor had kind of just assumed that this was the done thing these days, and that's what he had to do to compete. So when the treatment had finished and the patient was happy, he said to the patient orally, "Would you mind if I post a before and after photo on Instagram?" And he thought that the patient said yes. So that's what he did. And this before and after photo went on Instagram with the eyes blurred out to try and disguise her somewhat. He wasn't posting the whole photo. But a couple of days later, this patient phoned the clinic in floods of tears because the patient's friend had seen this before and after photo on Instagram and had recognised the patient and had got in contact, or just a little WhatsApp, saying, glad to see that procedure went well for you, hun. You'll have to give me the number of this doctor. And the patient was horrified because in her mind, she hadn't, in fact, consented to have her photos put online. So I don't know there whether she'd forgotten that they'd had that conversation or whether there was a complete miscommunication or what happened. But, the long and short of it is that this photo was there online for all to see, and the patient was very unhappy about that. So obviously the doctor quite rightly took the photo down immediately, but really the damage was done. The doctor unfortunately didn't really have a legal leg to stand on because he had no written evidence that this patient had agreed to put these photos online. And there's actually a section of the Data Protection Act, Section 168, which gives a patient a right to get cash compensation just for hurt feelings. They don't have to show any financial loss. They don't have to show that it's affected their business or their, ability to work or anything like that. They don't have to show that they've got a diagnosable, psychiatric condition as a result of this action. They can just say, this caused me distress. I am entitled compensation. So this doctor unfortunately had to pay some money to the patient for their distress, even though there was no financial loss at all, and this photo had been taken down immediately. So that's really the risk. I think the risks are most acute with photos. So I would be extremely cautious about posting any photos whatsoever online, even if you've blurred out some of the features. It is possible, I think, to fall foul of the same data protection problem with a written comment as well. You'd have to be very careful about how many details you give about this patient so that they can't be recognised. Because essentially, if the patient is recognisable, then what you've posted is data about them. And that's why it can breach the Data Protection Act. So in terms of what you can do to protect yourself, I think first and foremost, really think twice before you post photos in particular, but any kind of good news stories about actual patients on your own website or your own social media channels. It goes back to what I was saying earlier. Have a think about how dependent you are on your own online profile to winning new patients. If you're not particularly dependent, then it might not be worth the risk and the admin difficulties to do it. So if you can get away with not posting information and photos about your patients online, then I would say just don't, and that takes the problem away. But if you do think that you need to be able to do this to compete effectively with your competitors, then you do need a very robust GDPR and Data Protection Act compliant process. Even if these photos are blurred out, they're going to count as data. So what you need from the patient is an express written consent in writing for you to use the photo in that way, purely for publicity. Even if these started life as a clinical photo that has to go into their medical records, you do have to take that photo because it's a clinical record. But you have to make it very clear to these patients that in addition to using this photo as part of their medical records, you are also asking permission to put it online as a publicity and a marketing thing. And they have to understand that. They have to consent to that additional use in writing. The other thing that GDPR does is patients have got a right to withdraw their consent to that usage. So you need to have good enough administration and records to be able to take down photos of that particular patient immediately if they phone you a week later and say, you know what, I've changed my mind. And that's really important because that's, again, it's part of compliance with the law. So I think the main thing is remember that even if you see lots and lots and lots of other practitioners or competitors posting lots of photos before and after and comments about their patients online, do remember that they might not be doing that in the right way. They might not be doing that with express consent. And you mustn't just follow in their footsteps without thinking about it properly. If you post any photos of patients online at all or post any other comments about them, you need their express written consent. Otherwise, you are essentially vulnerable to a claim under this part of the Data Protection Act.
Yeah, thank you. That's very clear and a very obvious cautionary tale there in the example that you provided. It really is a potential minefield. We've talked about handling good reviews and using good reviews to your advantage and creating a sort of positive profile to showcase your skills on your social media pages or website as a beauty or aesthetics professional. But what about the other side of the coin? What advice would you give to professionals who have received a bad review or bad reviews online? And in particular, what can they do about that and what can't they do about it?
Well, I think this is where we get into the slightly disappointing part where we have to explain that in some ways there's not a great deal you can do about bad reviews. So let's talk about perhaps what we can do to get them taken down. There are situations where you can get a post or a review taken down. And some people I've spoken to have said, look, I just find this really offensive. I want it taken down. I find it very hurtful. I want it taken down. And the disappointing thing and is that that's not enough. The services that will host reviews, and of course, there's all the social media channels as well, they don't have the capacity, the administration, or the will really to remove posts just because somebody finds them offensive or controversial. Indeed, I think there's probably an argument that a lot of their business model is having controversial content so that people will come and look at it. So you've got to remember and try and keep a cool head that however personally hurtful you find the comment, the mere fact that you find it personally hurtful, I'm very sympathetic to that fact, and you'll be surrounded by people who are sympathetic to that fact. But as far as the websites that host these reviews are concerned, it's irrelevant. It's not enough. So what you need to do is, if you see a post that you really, really, really want to get taken down, or a review, what you've got to do is go on to the parts of the website that explain the rules of engagement, the community guidelines, they call it different things, the terms and conditions, to find out what types of posts are allowed and not allowed. So to give you an example about false reviews, you're not allowed to post them. So if you're able to say, hang on, this must be a false review, then you can flag it to the moderators and ask them to take it down as a false review. Again, you can't explain to them that you think it must be false because of X, Y, and Z reason that then breaches the patient's confidentiality. It would be things like, for example, I knew of a clinic that only saw menopause patients, and therefore you'd expect that all of their patients would be females. And they had a very negative review by somebody called John. And so they were able to flag that and say, well, given our type of practice, that must be a false review. I've seen other examples of, I had a treatment with these people last month, and they can say, well, we weren't even open last month, so this must be a false review. So as long as you can show that it's a false review without breaching patient confidentiality, then that can be a good reason to flag a post and just ask the moderators to take it down. Other examples include use of obscenity or threats or threatening language and things like that. So if you're very unlucky and you have a review in there with swear words and things like that, it doesn't matter whether you disagree with the content. You can just say, look, this has got swear words in it. Moderators, please take it down. So the difficulty with that is that you can get some posts taken down if they offend against the rules of that particular website, but that's as much power as you've got. If you've got somebody who's written in polite language how much they disliked your treatment or disliked you, as long as they have said that in a way that that's their own opinion and it's not a false review and it's not breaching any of the other rules about obscenity and so on, then unfortunately you're stuck with it. And that's where we come back to the PR advice we spoke about earlier, which is, well, if you can't get rid of a negative review, all you can do is over time get it crowded out with more positive reviews.
Yeah.
That's what you can do in terms of getting them taken down. I would also say as well that once the initial shock and sometimes distress of seeing a horrible review about you fades away, it might be worthwhile thinking about these negative reviews as a learning opportunity. It might be worthwhile, once you've got a clear and objective head about it, and maybe sit down with a trusted friend to read through them. If you look through and think, you know what, there's a theme here and that's something I can improve, and that would be a good thing because this is a competitive market, and it might be that the only reason for the negative review is that competitors have raised the bar around you, and you just need to up your game in some respect to, win back the trust of those patients and get, stop future negative reviews.
I think that's great advice, Jo. I mean, I really do. I really think that there is always a learning opportunity through adversity, and just as with complaints, this is really sort of fertile territory to try and sort of create something positive and to make changes.
Absolutely. I think the difficulty is that if you have a small number of negative reviews and there's no particular theme in them, then you might find yourself with little to go on in terms of how you can prevent future negative reviews. But it's always worth keeping an open mind. I think the thing to remember is that the majority of your patients will be happy, but the irony is that happy people are less likely to post something online. It's more likely to be the ones that have very strong feelings, either extremely positive or extremely negative, that will trouble themselves to go and post something online. So if you can learn something from the negative reviews, then that's only going to be to your benefit.
And presumably, I mean, that's sort of one way of analysing the content of the bad review to make positive changes, to identify potential areas for improvement and so on. But what signs should professionals in these sectors look out for in a bad review or in negative comments to alert them to the risk that maybe this is just the start of something? This is a potential risk of a compensation claim or of legal action, or maybe a more formal complaint being made against them.
Oh, this is such an important question because in my experience of providing medico-legal assistance and notification helplines over the years, so often a practitioner's come to me and said, I'm really upset about this review. What can we do to get it taken down? And my first response has been, you know what? Let's get your insurers notified first, because if you notice they're saying this, that, and the other, that, written slightly differently looks like a claim. And once they take a step back and start to look at it a bit more objectively, we can see that that's essentially the risk of where it's heading. So what I would say is, again, the key thing is to read the reviews when you're feeling calm enough, maybe get somebody to help you read them in an objective way. Look and see whether they're suggesting that they had a very, very bad outcome, or even if they're alleging they were injured in some way. I mean, I've seen negative reviews online with people saying, well, I've been left with an abscess on my face. Well, that's a really, really serious complication. It might well have been consented for, but that's a really serious complication. And you can't rule out the risk that a patient would want to seek compensation about it. Another thing you can look out for is if they're talking about a complication in a way that implies that they really weren't expecting that. Because if they're saying that they weren't expecting a type of complication, well, are they in effect saying that they weren't adequately consented for the procedure? Because, of course, consent involves understanding what the risks are and what the outcomes might be. The other thing you have to look out for is any suggestion of financial loss. I've seen reviews saying, oh, this result is so terrible, I've not been able to go into work this week. Well, therefore, are they going to make a loss of earnings claim? Are they saying, oh, this procedure is so important for my work, I've got a public-facing job and it's affecting that? If they're essentially saying that affects their livelihood, again, that's really serious, and that's something that they might therefore take the next step and say, well, therefore, I want to get compensation from you. And a massive, massive red flag, of course, would be if they mention lawyers or claims, or if they mention that they're thinking of referring you to any kind of regulator or the CQC. All of those are big red flags. And I think the other thing to be really clear about when you're looking at these reviews, just to check whether they imply that the patient is thinking about a claim, is that you've got to take your own views about the merits of that claim completely out of the calculation. I've had practitioners speak to me and say, and I've said, well, look, the patient's saying that they've had a really bad outcome there. And the practitioner said, well, no, but they're wrong. I know that this is a really good outcome. But the thing is, though, that's not the test. We're not in a court of law arguing over who is in fact right and who is in fact wrong. What we're trying to do is predict whether this patient is going to be one who's going to pursue a complaint or a claim. And they might do that for a completely unmeritorious complaint as much as they do for a meritorious one. So take your own views about whether they're right or wrong completely out of the equation. It doesn't matter for this question. The question is this patient upset enough that they might bring a claim? And if they are, then it's time to speak to your insurers or your brokers, because you need to make sure that's notified to the right policy at the right time, because it can cause you problems down the line if you've seen this negative review in 2023 and then in 2024 you get a letter of claim. Well, the risk is that you could say, well, you were warned about this.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think as well, just to highlight one word in that, is the word might. It might give rise to a claim, because quite often an insurance policy will require you to notify your insurers of a circumstance that might give rise to a claim. And again, that is quite a low threshold. And it's something that I've certainly come across on numerous occasions, as you have, Joe, where the practitioner is convinced that there's no merit to a claim. But as you say, that's just not part of the consideration. So I think it's really helpful to flag that. Thank you. Can I just move it on a little bit? So we've talked a bit about negative reviews, but of course there are also the vexatious posts, the ones that are completely unjustified, but they're nasty and they're false and they're offensive. And I'm often asked about this, and I'd be interested to learn your views, but what sort of legal action is available under, say, defamation law for those professionals who are unlucky enough to receive that kind of unwarranted publicity?
Well, in theory, there are some remedies. As you rightly say, there's the Defamation Act, the current Act in force is the Defamation Act 2013. And the interesting thing about that act is that it in effect, it raised the bar for what you need to prove to be able to make a defamation claim in the first place. It used to be that you would only have to prove that the words would make somebody think less of you, in effect, and that would be enough. But these days, you have to prove that the review has caused or is likely to cause serious harm to reputation. And in order to prove that you've got serious harm to reputation, you don't just look at the words themselves and gauge how nasty they are. You've also got to look at what effect it's had on you and your practice. So just as an example, you might need to show that this review has led to a downturn in the number of new patients coming to you or clients coming to you. But the thing is, you have to prove that it was that review that caused the downturn and not other factors like a competitor opening down the road or the state of the economy, meaning that fewer people can afford to get treatments and things like that. So you're in a bit of a bind to start off with because the onus is on you to prove some quite complicated things. Not only is this post horrible and nasty and saying, really disgusting things about you, but it's also having a tangible effect on your business or your ability to market yourselves. That's very important to remember because I do sometimes speak to practitioners who are seeing a horrible post about them. They're understandably upset, and I'm very sympathetic to that. But they want to go straight down the route of, right, let's get some defamation lawyers, let's get this sorted out. And you have to explain to them that it depends on what information you can gather, what proof you can gather that this is going to make any difference to your practice. The other issue, of course, is that bringing defamation claims is or can be very expensive. And so in reality, in my experience, it's very rare for defamation to be a realistic remedy for an isolated negative review. I think it's much more realistic to think about the other factors we've talked about, such as whether you can get the post taken down under the rules of the host website and things like that, rather than thinking, right, I'm going to be sending them a letter of claim alleging a breach of the Defamation Act. Having said that, there are, of course, situations where the situation is serious enough that defamation can be a realistic remedy. So if you've got reasons to think that you might be able to meet the serious harm test, then by all means consider getting formal legal advice on your particular circumstances. But on a more everyday, more routine basis, I wouldn't be thinking of the defamation laws as the way to clear up your online profile. And unfortunately, this is another situation where there's not particularly a level playing field here. Your patients and your clients, they're typically not regulated individuals. They can post what they like about anybody online with relative impunity, but you are a regulated professional and you can only do what the law allows you to do. And unfortunately, that means that sometimes you've got to live with some nastiness about you online, which is quite sad.
Yeah. I mean, it is, as we've said previously, it's very much a one-way street in that respect anyway. We've talked about online reviews and public websites and forums and so on. Just finally, because I know that it's something that is used so widely in this space, I'd be very interested in your views about how beauty and aesthetics professionals can balance the convenience and the informality of using messaging services for communicating with their customer or their client, with the potential risks associated with that kind of informality, those quick responses, and particularly the risks of what they say in those communications being used against them in complaints or claims or regulatory investigations.
Well, this is a really interesting one as far as I'm concerned, because you're absolutely right. The convenience is fantastic. And I'm not at all surprised that lots of practitioners use services like, for example, the direct messaging services on the various social media sites. I'm not surprised that they use those to communicate with patients. It's just so reassuring for the patients to think, I've got my practitioner's number. I can drop them a message if I'm worried about everything, or if I'm concerned about something, or if I've forgotten to ask something. And it can be a really good way to give that reassurance and feel like you're building a rapport. And if you do need to share a photo, perhaps if your patient is worried about the outcome or a complication or something, it's so much more convenient to take a little selfie and ping it to your practitioner compared with having to go and see them face to face initially. So I'm not at all surprised it's being used. But unfortunately, in my practice, I've also seen a lot of downsides to communicating in this way. So the typical downsides I've seen are that particularly if the patient is upset or they're worried about a complication, they can be very, very impatient for a quick response. It seems that somehow if they phoned up and left a voicemail saying, can I come in for an appointment, they'd be completely comfortable about waiting a few hours for a response, and the same with an email. But if they've pinged you a WhatsApp and those two little blue ticks come up, so they know you've read the message, and now they're getting even more upset because they think that they've left you on read and they're not getting a response. Those situations cause problem because the practitioner then, in my experience, feels under a lot of pressure to dash off a response. And that's not always helpful because depending on the situation, you might need time to think and reflect and plan a response, particularly if they're raising issues that you don't think are right, that they're alleging things that you don't think are justified, if they're very upset and they need to be carefully calmed down. There's all sorts of reasons why you might need more time to respond. And particularly since, of course, people can WhatsApp you very much out of office hours, and it might be that you're at a meeting or seeing another patient or putting the kids to bed or whatever. You might not be in a place and a time where you can think with a calm head and compose a suitable response. And so I've seen situations where the practitioner feels under such pressure to respond that they do pretty much dash off a response. And that inflames the situation more because, perhaps the patient feels like they're being brushed off and they're not being taken seriously and things like that. So it can be, it can be really difficult to do that. So I would suggest that the best thing to do, even if you're communicating over WhatsApp with a patient, remember that these are clinical interactions with your patient. They might be talking to you about risks they're worried about. So they might be essentially discussing consent with you. They might be talking about a complication that's arisen, in which case you really need to think through what needs to be done clinically as well as how to manage the patient's concerns appropriately. These are not straightforward issues necessarily. If they're just messaging you saying, are you open tomorrow? Fine, you can dash off a yes or a no. But, if they're asking anything more complicated, don't put yourself in a position where you're giving a substantive response without time to think. It might be a good idea just to send a very quick response to say, I've seen your message, I'm considering it carefully, I'll be in touch as soon as possible, because that means that they don't feel like they've been left on read. They know that you've got your attention and that you're working on it. Because the difficulty is that, of course, these communications are written, they're indelible, they can be downloaded, and therefore, if somebody was to say, my allegation is that I wasn't properly consented, those messages are going to be part of that discussion. The other thing is that, of course, if the patient's very upset about how you respond to them on WhatsApp, if they feel like you've been dismissive or snappy with them, the risk is they could screenshot that and send it off to their group of friends and say, oh, don't go to this person. She said that I could have her number. And then when I contacted her, all I got was this, dismissive response. And that can make its way around a peer group very, very quickly. Even if, you manage to calm the patient down the next day, the damage has been done. So I would say that if you're going to communicate on WhatsApp, by all means do that. But remember, the informality doesn't apply to the fact that it's a formal communication with your patient. Don't write anything that you wouldn't want to go into the medical records. Don't write anything that you wouldn't want to be read out in a court of law, as the phrase goes. Make sure that your communications, they can be warm, they can be friendly, of course, but make sure they're always professional and that you've had a chance to think through the issues before you write anything down, because it's a lot more difficult to undo the damage from a faultless response than it is to send a holding response, manage their expectations about how long it's going to take you to respond, and then respond carefully, including sometimes you might want to respond with the benefit of some medico-legal assistance. I mean, sometimes if they are saying that they're essentially gearing up to make a claim, you might want a bit of help with that before you respond. And even with clinical issues like complications, it might be that it's a complication that you've not personally seen before, and you want to speak to a more experienced colleague before you tell this patient what they need to be doing. So don't let yourself be bullied into responding quickly just because it's an instant messaging service. You're still a professional. You still have to give proper clinical advice, and you still have to have time to think things through and manage things in the proper way.
That's really helpful. Thank you. I mean, you still owe a duty of care to the customer, and I think that's really, really clear advice and very sensible, because obviously we do see more and more communication in this way, in this space. Joe, I'm conscious of the time. We could talk, I'm sure, for hours about this fascinating topic, but I think we'll probably call it a day there. Just to say thanks again for appearing on the podcast this morning. It's been an absolute pleasure to see you again, and absolutely invaluable to get the benefit of your experience and expertise on these sort of very tricky areas, and just really to say thank you.
Well, you're very welcome indeed. It's been a real pleasure to come and talk about these issues, and I really hope that the information has been helpful and will help keep a few people out of difficulty and enjoying their practice, which is one of the most important things.
Of course, fingers crossed on that front. Thanks very much, Joe. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Altair Talks. If you did, please don't forget to subscribe or leave a like or a review on whatever platform you're listening on, as this helps spread the word. If you have any questions or comments or topics you'd like us to explore in future episodes, please do contact us, as we'd love to hear from you. You can find us on LinkedIn or visit our website at www.altairinsurance.com. Stay tuned for more episodes, and until next time, take care of yourselves. The information contained in this podcast is not intended to represent a complete analysis of the topics presented and is provided for information purposes only for practitioners in the UK. It is not intended as legal advice, and no responsibility can be accepted by Altair Insurance or Keystone Law for any reliance placed upon it. Independent legal advice should always be obtained before applying any information to particular circumstances.